Hello, good afternoon. My name is Andreas Umland. I'm a research fellow at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs. And I'm welcoming you today to a presentation and discussion of a report on the so-called Transnistria conflict in Moldova, which is, of course, a topic. Moldova and the relationships between Moldova and Russia is today a topic that is very much in the press and in connection with the gas crisis. But today we are going to focus here on the Transnistrian conflict in particular, and will not be commenting too much on the topical issues that are in the press today. The Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies has been created this year as a center focused on the Eastern Partnership countries, the six Eastern Partnership countries and Russia. And these six countries are, of course, Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And within the work of this new center, we have created a report series that focuses on the protracted conflicts in this area. And this is now the fourth report by Victoria Roșa from Moldova, whom I'm going to introduce in a second. The first three reports were on the Donbass, and this is now our first report in this series on the protracted conflicts in the post-Soviet space, which is not focusing on Ukraine, but on Moldova. The report by Victoria Roșa has already been published as a PDF on the website of the Center and the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. It is downloadable, freely downloadable, it's open access. You can easily access it. And we will not be presenting here the entire report, which is much more detailed than we are going to be able to cover here. We will only discuss selected parts of it with our discussant, William Hill. And this leads me to our two speakers today, whom I am very happy to introduce now. The author of our report and our first speaker today is going to be Victoria Roșa, an expert on international relations with a particular focus on the Eastern Partnership countries, the European Union, Transatlantic Cooperation, NATO, and Russia. Victoria served as a security and defense and EU affairs advisor to the Moldovan Prime Minister Maia Sandu. Prior to that, she held the position of an executive director of the Foreign Policy Association of Moldova. She holds a BA and MA degree in international relations, political and administrative sciences from the Moldova State University, where she has also lectured in the past. And in 2017, she was a memorial fellow of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. At the moment, she lives in Riga and is a member of the global network of women peace builders and of the UN Women Moldova Civil Society Advisory Group. She is our main presenter today, and as I said, the author of the report that has been published and that we will discuss today. And our distinguished commentator today is Dr. William Hill, a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies in Washington, D.C. He was a diplomat previously and served, among others, for 2 terms in January 2003, July 2006, and June 1999, and November 2001 as ambassador and head of the OSCE mission to Moldova, where he was charged with negotiation of a political settlement to the Transnistrian conflict and facilitation of the withdrawal of Russian forces, arms, and ammunition from Moldova, which is also going to be the major topic of our discussion today. During his foreign service career, he served in Moscow, Leningrad, Belgrade, the US CSCE delegation in Vienna and Dakar, and of course also in Washington, D.C. He's also a scholar and the author of the books Russia, the Near, Broad, and the West, Lessons from the Moldova Transnistrian Conflict, and of another book, No Place for Russia, European Security Institutions since 1989. William holds a BA in history from Harvard and a PhD in Russian history and Soviet politics from the University of California at Berkeley. So much about our speakers who are going to speak in a second. Before that, I want to give some instructions for the audience. We are going to have 3 parts in this presentation. First, we will have Victoria present her report. Then we will have William discuss her report. Then we will have a short question and answer session moderated by me. And after that, after about half an hour, or from now on about 25 minutes, we will have question and answer sections where you can ask your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom function, or in the comments section of the Facebook presentation if you are watching us via Facebook. At the end, we are going to have a summary of our discussion by Victoria and William. And this would seem to be the main story today and the main instructions. And I would once more encourage you to make your comments, to ask your questions, either via Zoom or via Facebook. I will get them and then read them out and present them to the speakers. And without further ado, I would now give the word to Victoria Roșa to give us a short summary of her published report. Thank you. Victoria.
Yes, hello, good afternoon or good morning to everyone. First of all, please let me thank the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, but also our moderator, Andreas Umland, Ambassador Hill, but of course, all of you for the interest and opportunity to discuss today an issue of major importance for the domestic, but also foreign policy of the Republic of Moldova. Why so? Why both domestic and foreign policy? Well, because over 30 years, the conflict, which was thought to be easy to solve due to the widespread assumption that it is a secessionist struggle with domestic political rooting, transformed into a protracted conflict with a settlement mechanism, which involves today international actors. Nowadays, the nature of the conflict is more contested, and it generates a very heated discussion in the Republic of Moldova. The conflict has been referred to differently, but the internal debate about how to interpret the conflict touches upon 2 factors that could pave the way to a potential settlement. First, the debate raises the issue of an effective reunification policy that would consider the costs of reunification. And here we are talking about both financial but also political costs. And in this context, we see now a new approach of the political elite in Moldova. For the first time, I would say that we have a Moldovan leader, and here I'm referring to the Moldovan president Maia Sandu, who is talking about the need to adopt a broadly agreed political document, a political settlement document, in which the sovereignty and integrity of the country are respected and which would secure the future functionality of the unified state. Also, the Moldovan president refers to the need to seek fundamental conflict settlement rather than merely tackling technical issues in small steps, which has been the strategy for many years and raised questions regarding its viability. The second issue emerging from the analysis of the conflict nature points out Russia's role, which is a dual one. On one hand, it is a supposed mediator between the conflicting parties, and on the other hand, a crucial supporter of the separatists, if not, one may also say, an actual aggressor against Moldova. Throughout the years, the Russian Federation majorly supported the Transnistrian region leaders, both in negotiations as well as in their illegal activities in the security zone. Russia continuously refuses to finalize the withdrawing of the military contingent. And here I refer particularly to the operative group of the Russian forces and ammunition from the Republic of Moldovan territory. And I recall here that we still have on the Moldovan territory 20,000 tons of ammunition. Russia's dual role raises serious concerns regarding the viability of the negotiation format and the effectiveness of the conflict resolution process. At the same time, as an additional challenge, the current negotiation format, the 5+2 format, has as mediators two actors, two countries with an open conflict. And here I refer particularly to Russia and Ukraine, which completely changes the situation. Having this in mind, the created situation calls for an increased attention on behalf of the international community, such as of the EU and the US, the geopolitical aspects of the conflict being absolutely obvious, as well as a potential discussion on how to make the negotiations more effective but also functional. Defining the role of Russia is crucial for the further developments. Otherwise, the dialogue with the Russian Federation will allow an intensification of the existing problematics and the controversial issues in such fields as the socio-economic and trade relations, energy, security, and we already see this coming. The third issue I would like to raise attention to is the formulation of a nationwide reconciliation strategy that would counteract the disinformation and false narratives that feed the conflict. The Transnistrian issue should be open to the larger public and presented as a challenge to the national security of the Republic of Moldova. All stakeholders should speak out in a user-friendly manner. Why this is important? Because in Moldova, if you will talk to ordinary people, there is very few information, but also understanding of what the conflict represents for the future of the Republic of Moldova and how it impacts the domestic, but also the foreign developments in the region. In my recommendation, I also referred to the national broadcaster of the Republic of Moldova, Moldova 1, as well as the Audiovisual Council, because I think that they are actors that could and should be involved in widespreading genuine information about the conflict, but also setting a path for positive information and not one which is delivering propaganda, but also disinformation. I will stop here because I have very limited time. These are my initial remarks, but I will gladly talk about some other issues in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Many thanks, Victoria. And now I give the word to William for his comments and further elaborations.
Well, thanks very much. My thanks to the Stockholm Center, to you, Andreas, and to Victoria Roșa for the opportunity to participate in this webinar and to comment on this ambitious paper. Indeed, it's puzzling not only to observers, but it's frustrating to those of us who participated in the settlement process that the Transnistrian conflict remains unresolved after 30 years. The reasons that I see for this are many and complex. Why Chişinău, Tiraspol, and interested international actors have been unable to produce a settlement. In these initial brief comments, I'll address several broad aspects of the conflict and settlement process and issues raised in the report and with the hope that in our discussion, we'll be able to address these and other important questions in greater detail. First, let me say that the conflict, its causes, present state, and prospects for settlement remains controversial, both in Moldova and beyond, outside internationally. Victoria's paper seems to me to stem from a broad school that emphasizes geopolitical factors in the conflict, in particular the role and responsibility of Russia for the origins and the prolongation of the conflict. Now, I would be the first to recognize the often unhelpful role of Moscow in the settlement process and the management of the conflict. in particular with longstanding economic subsidies and political support, which have facilitated Tiraspol's establishment of de facto state institutions and Transnistria's consolidation as an unrecognized but de facto independent entity. The paper notes specifically that many international actors and observers have maintained that this should be the easiest of the post-Soviet conflicts to resolve. The reasons why this seems to be the case are, in my opinion, widely misunderstood for a number of specific, or a number of specific points. First, although the term frozen conflict is widely used, the Transnistrian conflict has been anything but frozen over the past 30 years. There have been constant, significant social, economic, and political changes over the past 3 decades on both the left and right banks of the Dnistru River. These changes have had significant effects on the situation, the calculations, and possibilities within the formal settlement process. It's important to keep in mind that the Moldova and Russia of today both are very different from what they were 30 years ago. And this makes a real difference in how you have to deal with the relations between them and with the conflict. Second, although language, or more precisely the language law of 1989, played a role in the genesis of the conflict, there is little or no communal enmity between the populations of the left and right banks. Unlike in Abkhazia, Karabakh, Cyprus, Kashmir, or a number of other conflicts around the globe, in Moldova, large numbers of the populations on both sides, both banks of the Dnistru, mingle and interact freely, daily, go back and forth, study, work, go to restaurants, exercise in sport halls, attend plays, sporting events. It's remarkable. If you're in Moldova today and you think there's a conflict going on, and yet thousands of people are going from the right bank to football matches on the left bank and vice versa. It doesn't seem, and that's why it seems like it should be easy, because the people see each other every day and they don't seem to be angry with each other. Third, while there can be no argument that geopolitics plays a significant role in the conflict, my experience in Moldova leads me to believe that geopolitical alignment is necessary, but it's not sufficient to achieve a settlement. There are significant domestic elements, in particular questions of property rights and mistrust between local political and business elites, that will need to be resolved for a stable, durable settlement to be achieved. It's important to remember, I believe, that this conflict began with Soviet Moldova in the late 1980s. The Transnistrian Republic was declared in 1990, ostensibly as a separate republic of the Soviet Union, and declared its independence only after the USSR dissolved. The military situation is also murky. It's clear, and don't get me wrong, Russian troops in the Transnistrian region are there without host country consent, and they should leave. But this alone is not going to solve the military security aspects essential to a settlement. Many of the troops in the Soviet 14th Army in 1991 were ethnic Russians, but they were also residents of Moldova. And while the 14th Army has become the much smaller OGRV, most of these troops from the 14th Army have not gone back to Russia, but they've transferred into military forces that are supposedly under Tiraspol's command, and they will not necessarily be required to leave as part of a Russian withdrawal. This subject's complicated, and we can go into it in greater detail in the discussion, but I want to point out that the military question is not as simple as it seems on the very clear legal aspects. Finally, international interest and involvement in Moldova has changed dramatically over 3 decades, as well as the international environment. In the early 1990s, the U.S. was busy with Iraq and the former conflict in the former Yugoslavia. Europe was just beginning to construct the EU, and Russia under Yeltsin was widely seen as an emerging democracy. The West trusted Russia and often supported Russian peacekeeping and conflict management efforts. One example is UNAMIG in Abkhazia. Cooperation in Moldova was extensive in the 90s, and this explains to a significant extent how we got there. and to where we are today. As the EU and NATO moved east, and as Russia became more authoritarian, working relations between Moscow and Western interlocutors became much more difficult. Now, this was also reflected in Moldova. In the 90s and the early 2000s, we were discussing the basic issues of status and an overall settlement. And a settlement was almost reached twice, in 1997 and 2003. But by 2010, there had been no negotiations going for almost 5 years when the talks were resumed in late 2011. And by that time, it was almost impossible to discuss anything other than technical issues. In sum, I find myself disagreeing or finding different shades and ways, angles, looking at some of the issues that Victoria Roșa raises in different ways. But I do agree fundamentally with most of the points, especially in the first 5 points of her conclusions and her recommendations for Moldovan authorities. My final point would be that while we may disagree on some things, almost all of those involved in the Transnistrian settlement process, and certainly I, from the very beginning, have been guided by the same principles, and we pursue the same aims. These are Moldova's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, with an agreed special political status for the Transnistrian region. These are clear, and almost everyone agrees on these. The problem is that we disagree on what means and paths to take in order to get there. And this is why this remains still a big problem, in my view. Thanks very much for letting me participate. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, William. That was very enlightening and quite a, I think, appropriate addition to what Victoria has said. I want to remind our viewers that you can pose your questions and comments in the Q&A section of the Zoom operation here, or within Facebook if you're watching us on Facebook, in the comment sections, and then it will be sent to me to be read out here. Victoria, do you want to immediately reply to something that William has said, or I would have a number of questions I want to ask.
Well, I could not agree more to what Ambassador Hill has mentioned, because I think that I definitely see all the arguments which were presented, and I think that what I would like to emphasize is for sure that today Republic of Moldova is not what it was 30 years ago, and Russia as well. And actually, the political elite that we have in Moldova at the moment has another approach, and it definitely puts the fight against corruption as being one of the most important aspects. And I think that this is also one aspect that it actually is important in the conflict settlement as well, because we are talking about political elites, we're talking about business elites, which have a big impact on the conflict settlement as such.
Yes, and maybe I want to immediately continue on this issue and on something that you said, that William also said before, that there's not much enmity between the citizens of Moldova on both sides of the Dnistru, and that relates also something to, in my own biography, I'm from East Germany, and we have the Germans have lived even longer separated, and that is also an issue very much discussed now in Ukraine, whether the separation of the occupied parts of the Donbas and of Crimea from Ukraine, from the Ukrainian state, from the government-controlled areas, will have lasting effects. What is your maybe Victoria or William? Maybe you can add something on this issue of identity formation that may be taking place in separation, but may actually not be so consequential. At least in Germany, it has turned out to be not so consequential, that we have lived in different parts of the German state. At the end, we could reunite without larger problems. But maybe you could comment on this further. How, because people are actually growing up in different systems.
Who should start first?
Victoria, maybe you start.
Yeah, maybe I can start. Yes, of course. Indeed, you have posed a very interesting but also important question, because as we know, the Transnistrian region is an isolated region, and indeed they are facing and they are receiving different information that we are receiving on the right bank. As you know, we don't have access on the left bank in terms of informational space. It is mostly in the Russian informational space. And indeed, this poses a challenge because we already have a generation of young people who were raised in the so-called Transnistrian independent state, as they are mentioning. So this is definitely a challenge that we have to face. And this is why I consider that it is very important to mention in my report that we need a nationwide reconciliation strategy, which will include actually wider communication to the larger public on both banks about the conflict itself, but also the resolution process. On the other hand, we have to mention that even though we have a generation of youngsters already raised and grown up in the Transnistrian region, at the same time they are talking to their parents, to their grandparents, to their relatives on the right bank. And as you have mentioned, we don't have hatred among the people. And this is one of the most important things, because I think that each of us can find relatives on the left bank or on the left bank on the right bank. That means that people are communicating, people are traveling, even though it is difficult sometimes to travel, but still there is this kind of communication among people. And this is why I think that the conflict, it will be easier to solve if there's going to be a political solution to it. At the same time, I think that here comes also a question of ownership of the Moldovan government, and something that they have to take on their shoulders, practically to issue, but also to make public policies which will encourage people on the left bank to come to the right bank and not to fear to register with the national authorities in case that we are talking about businesses, if we are talking about civil society, if we are talking about social protection and so on and so forth. So we should on the right bank be more attractive for the people on the left bank. And in this, should the Moldovan government show its small step strategy and closer relation to the Republic of Moldovan citizens residing on the left bank of the Dnistru River.
William, any comments further on that?
Yeah, no, three things, or three basic things, and hope I can get through them quickly. I very much applaud the approach of the new government, because it's recognized that the first priority, for most of the population on the right bank, the Transnistrian conflict is not the most important issue for them. It's their, the economy, corruption, how they will make their living, and European integration is part of that. The government, it seems to me, has embarked upon a course that recognizes that the primary purpose is to improve and reform conditions on the right bank, which deteriorated considerably, unfortunately, under oligarchic rule. And if this helps the Transnistrian issue, that's good. But then they also, I think, realize that you need to pay attention to Transnistria. And this is where, an explanation, both to the population of the right bank and also the left bank, a better public presentation of why it's important the issues that the conflict covers or involves, and why these are important to Moldova's security and prosperity is quite necessary. The second point, my second point is, ironically, I mean, there are, you can find examples to the contrary, but since the very beginning, the Transnistrian economy has been oriented as much towards Western Europe as it has been towards Russia. The big post-Soviet enterprises, when I arrived in the mid-1990s, they were doing more foreign trade with Western Europe than they were with Russia. And it was just the right bank was the ones that were selling more of the produce and agricultural products to Russia. And although many of these old post-Soviet enterprises have died out, just disappeared or been privatized, and Transnistria, the Transnistrian economy is now dominated by a gigantic conglomerate, Sheriff, who's best known in the West, perhaps for its football club, which is now in the Champions League. It's still, the Transnistrian economy is still considerably oriented to the European Union and does a great deal of business. And this means that for the population, perhaps not for the narrow elite, administrative elite at the top that rule in Tiraspol, but for the population in Transnistria, European integration is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. They do business there. A lot of them want to go there. They want to participate in Europe. And so this is a condition that while there may be problems in dealing and convincing the people you're negotiating with, you don't have the same problems, in my view, in convincing the broad population that unification of a Moldova that's oriented towards economically trade and travel with the rest of Europe. This is not a problem with the broad population. So you have things that need to be done, but you also have conditions that if you can reach political agreement, both on an international scale and with the local people involved, you don't have the larger problems of post-conflict reconciliation that you have in a number of other conflicts around the globe.
Thank you, William. And this concludes the first part of our webinar. Now we are going to turn to the questions from the audience. And I just want to remind you that you can pose your questions in the Q&A sections of the Zoom function or in the Facebook comment section. And this is a webinar of the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. We have three questions that concern the sort of larger surrounding of the conflict, and I'm just going to read them out. So, for instance, one of our viewers asks, if this situation remains unresolved, what implications would it have for the Black Sea regions at large, especially if there is an escalation of the conflict? Would a solution to the conflict increase stability in the Black Sea region, or is that a naive analysis? If Russia decided to give up Transnistria, what are they giving up? Maybe you could write down the questions. And another question regarding the surroundings. Transnistria borders also to Ukraine. What is the policy of Ukraine with regard to Transnistria? Maybe you could try to answer one or more of these three questions at first. Anybody feels? Victoria or
yeah, well, I can start if sure. That's okay with you. Yeah. So I will start with the last question because some of the participants mentioned about the fact that the Republic of Moldova border, which is on the Transnistrian side, does borders Ukraine, and indeed the constitutional authorities do not have access there, but due to the colleagues in Ukraine, but also to the common check borders, we can control this part of the border. And I think that this was a crucial support from the part of our Ukrainian colleagues and partners and neighbors. Indeed, Ukraine also plays the role of mediator in the 5+2 format of negotiations. And we can mention that it has been two phases. One, I would say, before 2006, maybe, where when Ukraine was a little bit more reluctant to support Republic of Moldova in finding a solution due to different political sympathization of the Russian Federation. But the situation changed dramatically after 2014, when the Russian Federation annexed Crimea, but also the ongoing conflicting situation in Donbass. Because at that point in time, Ukraine actually understood the situation that Moldova is facing, and the fact that the conflict in the Transnistrian region does poses a lot of uncertainty to Ukraine as well. So this is why today we actually have a friend and a partner in solving the Transnistrian conflict, and I think that the discussions that are ongoing now actually tackles a little bit from another perspective the resolution of the Transnistrian conflict, also focusing on the regional security in the Eastern Europe as such. And here I come to the next question, that it was related to the fact if Russia decides to give up Transnistria, what it will give up. I'm not really sure if Russia will decide to give up on the Transnistrian region, because as I have mentioned in my paper as well, this is also a geopolitical issue in the middle. For the Russian Federation, the Transnistrian region is important due to the fact that it actually helps Russian Federation keep under control both Moldova but also Ukraine, and it gives Russian Federation the possibility of maneuver when it comes to negotiating different aspects, be it social, economic, or trade with the two countries. Also, if we're talking about resolution to the Transnistrian conflict, I think that now it is very hard to actually talk about a resolution that would entail the negotiation between the two conflicting parties, because as we understand, the key to solving the conflict lies not only in Chişinău and Tiraspol, but also lies in Moscow and a wider security arrangement in the Eastern Partnership area.
William, any?
Let me also add on the Black Sea security. I mean, in my view, if God forbid that there's been no fighting in Moldova for almost 30 years, if it came to military hostility or hostilities of any sort, I think my view is that those would be very unlikely to spill outside the borders of Moldova. But where Transnistria affects all of the region is corruption. I mean, as one senior official told me years ago, explaining how this works, Transnistria, unrecognized, serves as a gigantic offshore. And it's not just that you have crooks in Transnistria. You've got crooks everywhere. And Transnistria, the use of Transnistria in moving goods and services and money and things has enabled the continued operations of criminal elites, criminal businesses in Moldova proper, in Romania, in Ukraine, in Russia, throughout the region. And we've seen this, it's ongoing. And the amounts of problems have had over past 2 decades, it's clear this wouldn't solve all of the problems. The Russian laundromat went through Chişinău and Latvia. It didn't go through Moldova or didn't go through Transnistria, but it would help considerably. On what is Russia giving up, I'd only add that my perception has been, and watching how this has worked over the years, what Russia gets out of Transnistria is leverage, influence over all of Moldova. And what Russia wants, they don't tell us in particular, so you have to try to figure this out. But it would seem that Russia's goal is a Moldovan government and state that is disposed favorably to Russia. I mean, all of Moldova, not just Transnistria. And so that's what presumably they would be given up. And on Ukraine, I would just note that before 2014, Ukraine competed with Russia for influence in Transnistria settlement, but it also facilitated Russian access to Transnistria. And post 2014, Russian troops resupply. I mean, Russian trains don't go through Ukraine. Russian planes don't fly over Ukraine. And Russian military or officials going to Transnistria go through the Chişinău airport, which means that it's a lot harder for Russia to maintain the kind of resupply, reinforcement, and control that it had with Transnistria before 2014. It's not impossible, but it's much more difficult. And Ukraine is working much more closely with Moldovan authorities than it did pre-2014. What result this will produce is still an open question, but the situation has changed substantially, and these changes are very much to the advantage of Moldova and to, I believe, an eventual settlement of the Transnistrian question.
Thank you, William. And we have a lot of interest here and a lot of questions. We will probably not manage to do all of them in the remaining time. But there's another segment, the interaction and comparison of the different protracted conflicts. One of the questions here is about the differences between the war in the Donbass and the conflict in Transnistria. The Second Karabakh War's influence on the mindset of different actors dealing with the Transnistrian conflict settlement. Is there any impact of the Karabakh War of 2020 on this conflict? There's also a question here about whether Russia has a standard template for frozen conflicts, or is that different from region to region? Perhaps if you could elaborate a little bit more. You did that already in your presentations on how you would think these conflicts in Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, and partly even in Azerbaijan, compare and interact with each other. Victoria, do you want to start, if you have anything to say on that?
Yes, definitely. I think that indeed there is a pattern that the Russian Federation is using, and I think that this pattern started with the Transnistrian conflict, because we see a lot of similarities of how the situation unfolded in Ukraine. And here I refer to Donbass particularly. The compatriots policy worked very well both in the Republic of Moldova but also in Ukraine, even though we talked previously about the fact that there is no ethnical component of the conflict as such. I think that we have to differentiate a little bit of between the situation in Moldova, Ukraine, but also the situation in Karabakh, but also in Georgia, because even though there are particular similarities, but the situation is a bit different if we go into the essence of the conflict as such. So this is why I think that for Moldova in Ukraine, there should be much more cooperation. There should be much more discussions at different levels. And here I refer to civil society, but also to authorities. We should have a platform where we can discuss about the security situation, but also to see how we can have a common stand on what's going on in the region from the security architectural point of view. At the same time, I think that Moldova and Ukraine can cooperate more in order to promote their European agenda. And here I would say that cooperation with Romania is also an asset due to the fact that Moldova finds itself at the border with Romania. And if we will start thinking more in infrastructural terms, then I think that a lot of conflicting situations can be overcome. And indeed, a closer partnership between the three countries, Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, could actually make Moldova, but in this case particular, Moldova more attractive for the Moldovan residents in the Transnistrian region.
Let me just add that I think it's a temptation to see similarities between all of these conflicts because Russia's involved in one way or another in all of them. But I would use an analogy. It's like if you're looking at different structures where you've got the same builder, but the builder in one structure is using bricks, and in another structure is using boards, and in another structure is using metal. You're going to get very different structure, even though the same builder is involved, because the materials with which the builder is using differ substantially. And therefore, I tend to, indeed, if there are commonalities that involve Russia, and if Romania, Ukraine, and Moldova can find ways to act together that enable them to, each to pursue common and individual aims, that's a good thing. But you have to remember that some of the differences. Karabakh is very different because it's a war between two states, Armenia and Azerbaijan. There is an unrecognized and separatist entity, but it's ultimately an interstate war. I recently did a piece for some of my Moldovan colleagues where I looked at the similarities and differences between Donbass and Transnistria. There are similarities, but there are a couple of big differences. One important thing to remember is Donbass is on the border with Russia, and Transnistria is not. It's 700 kilometers or so away, and it's separated by Ukraine that's not on very good terms with Russia right now. That makes a difference in how you evaluate what you can do. And so therefore, it's important, I think, to enumerate both the similarities and differences and evaluate them as to see where that brings you out in terms of policy. So it's more complex than it seems.
If you allow me, Andreas, I just want to add one more thing, that for Moldova, the way that the situation develops in Ukraine is very important, because even though Moldova does not have a border with Russia, and this is very well pointed out, this leaves us a little bit of time. In case Ukraine falls, Moldova will be next. So this is why I think that it is very important for the Republic of Moldova to think several steps ahead, and to be very much engaged in the situation in the region, but also to support our Ukrainian friends in their fight for sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Thank you. And we have another section of questions that basically are about the issue of what is in for Russia there and what does it cost to Russia. For instance, there's a questions about the huge debt for gas that Transnistria now owes to Russia, and what happens to that if Transnistria will be united with Moldova. There is a question about the passport issue There is a question here about Transnistria as a backyard for special purposes for Russia, for the Kremlin, and questions about the financial costs of subsidizing and patrolling the Transnistrian region for Russia. Is there anything you can and want to comment on the costs and benefits that Russia has in connection with Transnistria?
Let me talk about the gas very briefly. I mean, from the very beginning, Russia has sold natural gas to Moldova and has not made the Transnistrians pay. In 2000, the Moldovan government separated the accounts of the right bank and the Transnistrian region, and Moldova kept relatively current on its payments to Gazprom. But Transnistria accumulated a huge debt, which has been multiplied by the Russian. It's artificial and it's outrageous. The Russians have this debt to from Transnistria, while they're not demanding payment from Transnistria, but then they have added penalties and interest to it. So the figure they claim is something like $7 billion. Gazprom is never going to get this. It's like getting the English idiom is blood from a stone. The idiom translates into Russian as moloko od kozla. There are other languages you can find, but it's something. And Gazprom eventually is going to have to recognize this and write it off. Right now, they're still trying to get historic debt from Moldova, and it's part of the problem in the negotiations. And Gazprom they've given this money. It's never going to come back. The Transnistrians are outrageous, too, because they charge their own consumers for gas and then take the money and use it on their budget rather than paying Gazprom with what the consumers have paid. So Transnistrians basically have been getting a double subsidy from Gazprom. That's $30 to $60 million a year. At least it was when I was there. After 2006 and a crisis on exports and with customs that's mentioned in the paper, the Russians have started giving money, financial, direct monetary subsidies to Transnistria. It's not a big amount because it's not a giant entity. So for the Russians, they're paying much more for the war in Donbass and for some other places, but it is an expense. But this is something that they pay in order to have leverage beyond Transnistria, in my mind. So they would save a little bit. The question is, do they really want to save this much money to abandon the political aims they have? And that's an open question. But the gas crisis, and I just want to be clear because you'll see a lot of the public statements that are going on now. You can read what Gazprom is issuing today. And it's just outrageous because they've given this gas away for 30 years, and now they're demanding that someone that didn't get it is going to pay for the alleged debt, which they've multiplied outrageously. They do it because they can. And the sooner that Romania and the rest of Europe can devise alternative sources of energy for both Moldova and other countries that get large amounts of gas from Russia, the better off that everybody is going to be. And the less that you will have political disruptions because of the energy blackmail.
Victoria, maybe this could be also now already your concluding statement because we are actually running out of time. But please go ahead.
Well, definitely. Well, as a concluding statement, I would say that for sure, Republic of Moldova has to take ownership of what's going on in the country, but also evaluate how they can make the right bank more attractive for the left bank. At the same time, I think that tackling corruption would be one of the primary issues that could lead also for a potential settlement for the Transnistrian conflict. At the same time, we as a country, we should pay more attention when it comes to informing our public, when it comes to talking to our public, but also have a very well-defined communication strategy because only with the help of our citizens, but also with their backing, it is possible to go through very difficult both political crisis but also security crisis. And the gas crisis at the moment is one example that all the population has to be united to support the government in its endeavors to overcome this crisis. And maybe, as one of my good friends Stanislav Secrieru has mentioned in one of his public posts, he said that this could be, as it was with the wines embargo, this could be a crucial moment when Moldova can find alternative sources, and it could strengthen its energy security sector, and in this way it could decrease the leverage that the Russian Federation has on Moldova, but also on the Transnistrian conflict settlement.
Can I just add a couple sentences? I agree heartily with that. The point is,
Victoria. William, would you also like to have some concluding thoughts, maybe going beyond what we've said before?
No, we're right. Indeed, to follow on what Victoria just said, the thing to remember is the Transnistrian conflict is important, but it does not prevent Moldova from improving life on the right bank for all Moldovans, making Moldova more stable and more prosperous. And I think the new government has recognized this, is trying to fashion policies that will pursue these goals. There can be difficulties emerging from the Transnistrian question for Moldova, but these have not been fatal for Moldova over the past 30 years, and they don't need to be decisive for Moldova in improving life on the right bank. It's worth solving, it's worth paying attention to, but it's also worth remembering, that life in Moldova can get better even if the conflict remains unresolved for a little bit longer. And this, I think, is an important point for everyone, both in Moldova and abroad, outside of Moldova, to keep in mind as one approaches basic policies of domestic development, conflict resolution, and international relations for Moldova and for those that wish to support Moldova. So with that, I'll thank you for the opportunity to participate. I'm sorry we only have an hour because there are so many other good questions I see that would be worth pursuing.
Many thanks, and I want to apologize once more to some of the listeners. We had an exceptional large amount of viewers today, and some of the questions, some of the 1 hour that we have here today, to have the report by Victoria, and also from our discussion, Moldova is in a way the archetypical case for these protracted conflicts. We had the first 3 papers in this series of reports of the Stockholm Center for East European Studies on human rights and security in Eastern Europe on Ukraine, because Ukraine is the most urgent, the most burning issue today. But this 4th report that we presented here today was on the oldest conflict and the archetypical conflict, as we said already. And we will continue this series of reports on human rights and security in Eastern Europe with further reports on Nagorno-Karabakh, on Abkhazia and South Ossetia, on the international law issues that are involved with these protracted conflicts, on the nature and the origins, the essence of these conflicts, and Russia's role in all of these conflicts. We will also have a special paper on possible solutions for these conflicts. And in general, the focus of these papers that we publish in this series have been recommendations, practical policy recommendations, some of them here also now made by Victoria and William, that diplomats, politicians, activists, and journalists may notice and may discuss, and will hopefully help to solve also eventually these conflicts. And with these words, I want to also then thank Victoria Roșa once more and William Hill for their answers here today, and especially Victoria for her excellent report that, again,
thank you very much.
Say is freely available on the World Wide Web, on the website of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And this is a project of the new Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, created this year and focusing on the Eastern Partnership, the 6 Eastern Partnership countries of the EU, and on Russia. Many thanks, Victoria and William, for making your contribution to the work of our center.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you for all of you for the great discussion. And Ambassador Hill, it was an honor to have this discussion with you here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.